So this morning, I do have a dead calf. I didn't even know any of the animals were having problems, and I got a dead heifer over on the by the pond over there, and then I got this calf right here, and you can tell when you take a look at him that he is definitely sick. Something going on with him, and so I went ahead and I gave him his shots. I gave him a shot of Zactran, and I gave him a shot of Banamine. And you can tell that he's sick, right? I mean, he's obviously panting pretty hard. When I was, when I was on him, giving him his shots, before I was giving him his shots, I could actually feel the heat coming off of his body, and so that's why I gave him the shot of Banamine as well. And I got a dead heifer, a small dead heifer by the pond, but I didn't even know that these animals were sick. And now that I take a close look, these animals, I got a sick animal and I got a dead animal. The thing is, and I got the animals out there right now. They're taking a walk around the pond. So I do have a sick animal and I do have a dead animal. And I'm not, trying to be too, harsh about this, but that's just kind of the circle of life. When you're in the cattle business, you're just going to see dead animals. It happens, and I actually think that maybe that this animal needs to get a shot. He's kind of coughing too, but the weather, it's been, the temperature suddenly dropped over the last few days. I had a sudden temperature drop, and it's been raining, and so I'm thinking maybe the calves got some kind of a pneumonia going around. And so I'm gonna get a hold of the situation starting right now. I got that an animal shot, and I'm gonna really get focused on getting a hold of the situation. If any of the animals look even relatively sick, I will be giving them a shot. And I'm not gonna replace the animal. I'm not gonna go to the sale barn for one animal. But it just is. I'm not looking to be too whatever about it. But it just is what it is. I mean. When you're, in the cattle business, the thing about farming, especially when you're farming livestock, is that, it's one of those things that you just see all the time. You just kind of get used to it. And I know that sounds horrible. And I'm not looking to make it sound horrible. I'm not looking to be, whatever about it. I'm just saying, and I don't know how else to put it other than you just kind of get used to it after a while. All right, you just kind of, at least I do. I mean, I don't, God knows that I didn't know that the animal was sick. If I knew that the animal was sick, I would have given the animal medication. I got a sick animal right there, sitting by the gate, sitting by the fence right there, and he's definitely sick. I gave him some shots. And so it is what it is. I'm going to work on really getting a hold of the situation. I'm going to see what's going on. And, if any of the animals even look remotely sick, I will be giving them a shot of antibiotics. And so the whole thing, okay. So, I was taking some time to think about this. And the whole idea of, and I've always said that a lot of people actually choose to be poor. All right, a lot of people actually choose to be poor. And what do I mean by that? And I said that a very realistic way to take a look at this, and I'll ask a question, and because the idea of perception, and okay, here's the thing about this too. In terms of legitimate poor people, in terms of I've only seen one person in my entire life who was legitimately spiraling downwards, that managed to legitimately turn themselves around, and they're not doing incredibly well, but at least they're not going in the wrong direction. I've only seen one person that did it in my entire life, and it was a 40-year-old woman with 2 kids, single mom. That was the only person that I have ever seen legitimately spiraling downwards, out of control, and turn themselves around. I've only seen one person do it. They may not be doing exceptionally well, but at least they're not going the wrong way. They legitimately turn themselves around. They may not have, wonderful things, or but she's got her 2 kids, I respect her for that. There's only one. I've only seen one person in my entire life that was legitimately spiraling downwards out of control, that legitimately turned themselves around. My entire life. All right, and it was a single mom, 40-year-old single mom with 2 kids. That's the only person that I've ever seen. And here's another way to look at it. In terms of opening up the perception and choosing. A lot of people actually choose to be poor, and so and I've always said, okay, so here's the $1,000,000 question. Let's say that right now I have decided that I am going to act like a poor person. Let's just say that right now, starting right now, I will act like a poor person. How long do you think it will take for me to become poor? I have decided that I will act like a poor person. How long do you think it will take for me to be poor? I'm going to go and live my dream. I'm just going to, whatever, YOLO. I'm just going to go and spend, every dollar that I have. How long do you think it would take for me to start from starting to act like a poor person to legitimately becoming poor? How long do you think it will take? Maybe 24 hours, right? Maybe 24 hours. I could go to the Lamborghini dealership right now and buy myself 2 Lamborghinis, and then I could go to the Gucci store and spend all my money. Maybe it would take me 24 hours. And then maybe I could, whatever, whatever, right? For the next whatever, right? But this is also what I mean, why it's so why it's so just bad to think like a poor person. Because if I decided to act like a poor person starting right now, I would become poor within 24 hours. All right, and here's the thing, and I always talk about, okay, so here's the thing. And I actually thought about this, and I was like, I wonder why do people choose to be poor? And from what I have seen, and I will address it from what I believe. So from my belief system is that people choose to be poor because they don't think that it's a good idea to go the other way. That's why. And here is what I mean. Why do I think that people choose to be poor? Because, and taking the single mother with the 2 kids, right? That's the only person that I have ever seen, a 40-year-old single mom with 2 kids. Legitimate. That's the only person that I've ever seen spiraling downwards, legitimately turn themselves around. And, the whole thing, and I think that it is because, when you're poor, if you, okay, and here's a very realistic sense. Let's say that you're poor, right? You're doing poor things, right? I mean, you spend every dollar that you make. You have no retirement. There's a very realistic possibility that in 30 years you still have to work, because if you don't work, you'll have no money. All right, and the economy will inflate, and the Social Security checks won't cover your basic necessities, and so you will be forced to work until the day you die. All right, I talk about the broader economy. Inflation, you can print dollars, but you cannot print assets, right? I talk about all this stuff, and I've always said that if you're barely scraping to get by right now, chances are in 30 years you will be having a horrible, miserable time. You might not even be able to retire, legitimately. All right, that's one of the things about, it's like the death by 1,000 cuts. All right, if you're not working to get in the positive direction, if you're barely scraping to get by, eventually you'll just get taken under. All right, and so why do people choose to be poor from what I see? Because, okay, let's say that you're poor, right? Let's say that you're poor, and you're in a situation where whatever, you don't have any retirement, right? You don't have anything saved, meaningful saved for retirement. You're scraping across the bottom effectively. Let's say you're spending more money than you make, and or whatever, right? Whatever it may be, it's causing you to be poor, right? But in a situation where you're going from being poor to not being poor, I always say that the first step from getting out of being poor is to being broke. If you become not poor, you can legitimately turn yourself from a poor person to a broke person tomorrow. All right, and what's a realistic way to do that? Well, if you spend less money than you make, right? If you spend less money than you make, and you take a look at your, because to me it's almost insanity. It's almost insane. Why would you spend more money than you make? Does that sound like a sane thing to do, right? If you spend more money than you make, that's almost insane. Why would you do that? Nobody cares about your dreams. I mean, save some money, right? Go and get a better job and then go and live your dream. You know, save up money for your dream or whatever it is, right? If you want to go on a vacation and it's going to cost you $5,000, then save up the $5,000. All right, don't go into debt to go on your magical journey. Nobody cares. All right, you know, and you know, YOLO is not a realistic outlook for life. All right, but you know, let's say that you're poor. All right, your life is whatever, spiraling downwards, right? Chances are, there's a very realistic possibility that when you're 75, you have no retirement. Social Security doesn't cover your basic necessities. The economy has inflated. Congratulations. Now you're, effectively, now you're reaping what you sowed. Right? You effectively have nothing, and et cetera, right? And so when you go from that to being broke, you're effectively now in a situation where, when you're broke, if you're not, progressively working to continuously do better for yourself, you will effectively stay broke forever. And I think that's why people, do not, choose to not be poor. I think that's why people choose to be poor, is because even if they go from being poor to being broke, if you do not continue to do better, when you've gone from being poor to being broke, if you do not continue to do better, you will actually be broke forever. And what's a realistic sense of this? Let's say that you're in a situation where you have gone from being poor to being broke. You've taken a look at your budget and you've actually reduced you've actually created some margin for yourself in your budget. You actually have whatever, let's just say even $200 a month left over. You've actually managed to, get your budget together in a way to where you actually have a couple of $100 left over every month, right? You've gone from being in the negative to at least being slightly above water, which is incredibly good. All right, and I talk about this all the time, if you're poor, the chances of you turning yourself around are borderline zero. If you're broke, the chances of you continuing to do better are, even that is borderline zero. And I think that a lot of people but I encourage people to do better all the time, right? You have to work on getting better. If you do not work on doing better, then you're effectively just, you could end up in a situation where you're 75 years old and you have no money. Now you have to work. If you don't work, you're going to go under. You're legitimately going to become a bum. All right, you have no retirement. The economy's inflating. And et cetera, et cetera. If you do not continue to work on doing better, you are, it's effectively a negative feedback loop. And I think that, from what I see, the reason that I see that is, the reason that I see what I see is because, when you go from being poor to being broke, what does that look like? You've effectively, gotten yourself in a situation where at least, now you're not in a negative feedback loop. At least you're not spiraling downwards out of control, right? You're not spiraling downwards. You're not doing worse as time progresses, right? And, but you may not be doing well, but at least you're not going downwards, right? And so in this situation, even if you're not going downwards, if you are not, pushing yourself to go, pushing yourself to do better than broke, you will effectively remain broke forever. And I think that people are not okay with that. It's like you would rather, the whole thing about, you would rather, I was watching this TikTok thing, and it was this, almost idiotic young lady. And she was sitting there going, oh my God, well, why be $180,000 in debt? Why be $180,000 in debt in America when you could be $181,000 in debt in Hawaii or in the Caribbean on some island somewhere? And the whole thing was, why wouldn't she just take an extra $1,000 worth of debt to go and, go on a trip to an island? And here is why. Because if you put yourself in that situation, and chances are, if you are $180,000 in debt, in non-equitable debt, your debt has been utilized to purchase something that is not equitable, you're effectively boned. All right, and I'm not saying it's not because of the amount of money. It's because of your decision-making process. Chances are, like if you are $180,000 in debt, you could, if you took drastic measures, you could legitimately, probably, the average person could probably pay that off in 4 or 5 years if you took drastic measures. All right, but chances are, if and this is also a very, realistic look at the decision-making process, right? Why be $180,000 in debt in America if you can be $181,000 in debt on a trip to Hawaii, right? Why not, right? But the thing is, okay, and I'm, in reality perspective, I have only seen one person in my entire life ever that has gone from being poor to being broke and legitimately has found their peace with God about it and has maintained that for a long period of time. They did not go back to being poor. They may not be rich, they may not be wealthy, but at least they're not poor. I have only seen one person ever do that in my entire life. A lot of people, they'll kind of fiddle far around in this area of being poor and being broke, and then they'll choose to be poor. Why not just spend an extra $1,000 to go on a trip to Hawaii? You're broke, you're poor already. Right? I have only seen one person in my entire life legitimately go from being poor to being broke and stay broke. They may not be doing very well for themselves. They may not be, they may not have, the most whatever, the most luxurious things, but at least they're not poor. I've only seen one person do that and maintain that over a long period of time, not go back to being poor. I've only seen one person ever do that, and it was a 40-year-old woman with 2 kids, a single mom with 2 kids, immigrant. That's the only person I have ever seen. And I think that the whole thing about being poor is that people choose to be poor because it's like, why would you, if the other option between being poor and being, if it's like you're only presented 2 options. But here's the thing, I am telling you that there is a third option. If you go from being poor to being broke, and that you can actually go from being broke to doing well for yourself. And how do you do that? You start investing your money. All right, and it's going to take a long time. There is legitimately zero easy way around this. There is no easy way around it. But I think that there is legitimate, but that's the big reason why. It's because it's like a lot of people do not consider the possibility of doing very well for themselves. You have the capacity to do very well for yourself. Everybody does, granted that you were born average. All right, but I think that a lot of people get it completely, they get it kind of twisted, almost like completely twisted, where they only see 2 options, where it's either they're going to be poor or they're going to be broke. That's how they see it. They don't see the possibility of doing better. And here's the thing, if you go from being poor to being broke, that's very good. That is incredibly good. Are you gonna have a good are you gonna have retirement money? No, you're not. Are you gonna be struggling for money? Yes, you will, but at least you will not be going the wrong way. All right, at least you won't be going the wrong way. You may not have the most incredible things, you may not have the most luxurious things, but at least you're not spiraling downwards out of control. That's a massive improvement. That is a massive improvement. And here's the thing, and I talk, let's go over this whole idea of the 10%, right? When I call, the whole idea of the 10%, if you manage to do 10%, you could legitimately, I may have 1 or 2 or maybe even a third animal die. I don't know. I'll get a grip of the situation as well as I can. But even if I have, right now I have 50 animals, and if I'm left with 47 animals, even when I sell the 47 animals, I will still make enough money to buy like a 80, 85. So, it just, I've been, but, the whole thing about the cattle business is you just kind of get used to it. And I'm not saying that from a malicious perspective, okay? I'm not saying that to be malicious. I'm not saying that to be a prick about it. I am upset about, but after a while, you just kind of, because, I don't know how else to put it, right? it's just a part of the business. And I know that it's kind of upsetting, and you don't I don't feel good about it, right? But it is what it is. All right. And but that's the thing, is that I think that the average person only sees two outcomes, but there is a third outcome, right? There is the possibility that you can do well for yourself. All right, a lot of people see the world as either they're going to be poor or they're going to be broke. But if you manage to go from being poor to being broke, just that is incredibly good, just because at least you're not going the wrong way. That's why, at least you're not going the wrong way. You're not legitimately putting yourself into an unrecoverable situation. You're not putting yourself in a situation where, you're going to be 80 with $200,000, $350,000 worth of debt, working some very, very, whatever, working a job that just barely gives you enough to just even get by. And at least you're not going to end up like that. I mean, you might end up in a situation where you're 80, working a job that barely makes you enough to get by, but at least you won't be $350,000 in debt. All right, and a lot of people, I think when they see that, they think that it's better to be $350,000 in debt and 80 years old, working a job that barely gets them by, because at least they whatever, right? But then what do you think's going to happen with that debt? Somebody's going to have to pay for it. All right, let's think about the long term. But I'm telling you, I only know one person in my entire life that has legitimately gone from spiraling downwards out of control, legitimately going downwards, and going downwards can also mean that you're legitimately 80, 75 years old with no retirement. And your Social Security is not cutting it anymore. That's legitimately what it could mean. The economy is probably going to inflate. You can print dollars, but you cannot print assets. The economy will probably continue to inflate. All right, your Social Security will probably not cut it. Not even give you enough to, if it even exists in 40 years. If it even exists in 30 years. Social Security might go bankrupt. All right, and if it doesn't, I mean, the amount of money that you're getting for it may not even cover basic necessities anymore. All right, that's what failure could look like. It could mean that you end up 75 years old with nothing. Or even worse than that is you are in the negative. Because it's like if you're 30, or if you're my age and you have whatever, and you have whatever, I mean, you have time to work on it, right? But if you're 75, I mean, it's practically a done deal. If you're 65, it's practically a done deal. But that's what it could look like. And I think that a lot of people only see two possibilities with their life. They see themselves as a poor person, or they see themselves as a broke person, and they choose to be poor instead. But that is not good. You should choose to be broke instead. Because if you're broke, at least you're not going the wrong way. All right, and what does that look like? Let's say that when you're poor, let's say that you're going negative $1,000 a month. And you have a 7% interest rate on this negative $1,000. Let's say that you're going negative $1,000 a month, and you're doing that on a regular basis. You're effectively doing that all the time. Effectively every month that goes by, you're another negative 1,000, or you're another negative 200. Let's just say another, whatever, $200. You're negative $200, and so you put it on a credit card, and which probably has a 15-20% interest rate. But instead of doing that, you take a look at your situation, and you objectively determine that if you take certain steps, you can actually turn your budget into something that puts you in the net positive $200 instead of negative $200. Right? You sold your car, and you bought an old Honda Civic. Right? You bought yourself an old Toyota Camry or a Honda Accord, right? I mean, these Honda Civics and these Honda Accords are effectively, their engines are practically indestructible, all right? I mean, you can put like 250,000, miles on one of these Honda Accords, and, you probably could. All right, and if you find a Honda Civic with 100,000 miles on it, or whichever way you did it, you managed to do it. You have gotten yourself out of thinking like a poor person. You have gotten yourself out of the negative feedback death loop, and at least you're not going downhill. But you may not be going uphill, and you may not be going uphill fast enough to effectively make a drastic change in your life, but at least you're not going the wrong way. That's very good. If you manage to do that, it would be a miracle. If you're legitimately going downhill, and downhill could take forms in many ways, right? I mean, you could legitimately end up in a situation where you're 75 and you have no retirement. That's what downhill could look like over the long term. You're going downhill slowly. But let's say that instead of going downhill slowly, you can start going upwards. You start going uphill slowly. You've actually come to the conclusion that you don't want to be poor anymore, and you have actually decided that you would rather be broke. You don't want to be poor, and you would rather be broke. Even if you manage to decide that, that would be incredible. I've only seen one person in my entire life that has managed to do that. And it was a 40-year-old single mother immigrant with 2 kids. That's the only person that I've ever seen ever go from spiraling downwards to legitimately, just turning themselves around and being broke over a long period of time. And she seems to have found her peace with God about it. I've only seen it happen one time. And so the whole thing, but even if you do that, and let's say that you find a way to whatever, go positive $200 a month, right? Now you're in the net positive $200 a month. If you are in the net positive $200 a month, that is not enough money to save your life. All right, you are going to have to continue to do better. You will still have to look for better opportunities. You will still have to work on doing better. And it's going to be hard. All right, I put a lot. There is no easy way out of this. It will be difficult. It will always be difficult. It was not even magically easier for me. All right, in terms of a realistic perspective, and this is also why I say about $15,000 to $20,000 a month, because sometimes things like this happen, right? I end up with a couple of sick animals. I end up with a dead animal. I thought I was going to make about 20 or whatever, 17, but now I'm probably going to make about 16, 15, and it's still more or less the same thing. All right, I still gotta, maybe I have another animal or 2 die, and even if that happens, I mean, I'm still drastically in the net positive. I talk about the whole idea of business. The whole idea of being in business is that, the thing about me is that, I effectively work by myself. I have very minimal equipment. My expenses are very low. My returns are very high. For me to effectively start losing money, I would have to lose about 40% of my animals. All right, if I have 50 animals, I would have to lose like 25. I would have to lose like 20. And I'm not going to lose 20 animals, all right? And so, the whole thing, but that's from what I see. Why do people choose to be poor instead of choosing to be broke? Because, in your insanity, you have decided that it would be better to be poor than to be broke. That's from what I see. And it's borderline insane. But I am here to tell you right now that it is not better to be poor than it is to be broke. You are monumentally better off being broke than you are poor. Monumentally. And if you manage to go from being poor to being broke, which I've only seen one person ever do in my entire life, if you manage to do that, and you continue to do better for yourself. And I think that the single mother with the 2 kids, I believe that, the whole reason that she did that was because she believes that in the future, if she does that, the way that she will do better for herself is because her children will be better off. That's what I think. I mean, this, when I see the woman, I respect the lady. Because I'm like, this is a lady. She barely, she, very, very, her education is not good, and she was legitimately poor. When I first saw the lady, I actually still know the lady, and and when I first saw her, she was legitimately poor. All right, she couldn't pay for her apartment and everything, and she was legitimately poor. All right, and now she's broke, and she's actually stayed broke for a long time. She has actually not reverted to going back to being poor. Sometimes, you know, she'll borrow $100 from me. Sometimes she'll borrow $200 from me, and she always pays me back. Always. She always pays me back. She tells me, I will pay you back next week, and she pays me back. Sometimes she'll borrow $100 from me and she'll pay me back. Sometimes she'll borrow $200 from me and she'll pay me back. You know, but I believe that when I see her, the reason that she did that was because she wanted to give her children a better life. That's what I think. And I'm like, you know, and her children are are pretty okay. I mean, they're not a couple of, they're not just, whatever. You know, one of them's got a job. I believe that they both got a job, and, you know, they're both just okay. They're both okay. All right. And I believe that she did that for, because she believes that, that her children will do better. But I have legitimately only seen one person in my entire life that's managed to go from being poor to being broke, and legitimately stay broke for a long period of time, not go back to being poor. All right, but if you go from being poor to being broke, that's a good thing. All right, you should not be in a situation where you're looking at your life and you're going, should I be poor or should I be broke? And then you choose to be poor. Don't choose to be poor. All right, don't ever choose to be poor. Being poor is not good. Even if you're going to be broke, you're better off being broke. Legitimately. All right, but understand that there is a third option. You can continue to do better. Don't go and whatever. And the whole thing about this is that, when you take a look at my situation, I legitimately am a first-generation cattleman, right? I'm a first-generation farmer. I legitimately started my own farm. And at the end of the day, I would, okay, my income will, okay, I will still make about $100,000 in the next 3 months off of this cattle business in my backyard and on my lease property. I will still make about 100 grand in the next 3 months. And guess what? My income is continuing to go upwards. All right, this is also, but from a longer perspective, when you take a look at what I did, you have to understand that I legitimately grew my business by over 1,000% in the last 2.5 years. I steadily grew my business over the last 2.5 years by over 1,000%. And here's another realistic way to look at it. And I've always said, and I've been talking about the point of inflection. If you thought that I made a lot of money, you are about to crap your pants. All right, the amount of money that I'm making is going vertical. And here's, and over the next 3 months, I will be selling whatever, I will be selling, 30, 34, 33, 32, something like that animals, all right? And when I sell these animals, I will legitimately make enough money to grow my business by over 50% by just taking the money that I make from my animals and putting it back into my business. I am continuing to do better for myself, astronomically, exponentially. All right, there is a, in terms of using my life as a timeline, effectively, me, when I first started this farm and I had my 5 cattle, I was broke. All right, that was effectively all of the money that I had. Even when I bought this farm, the bank told me that they weren't going to give me any more money. That was effectively all of the money that I had. It was everything, and I was broke, but at least I was not going in the wrong direction. All right, at least I was not going in the wrong direction, and I continued to do better for myself. And as of today, I legitimately grew my business by over 1,000% from that point. And I will actually probably increase the size of my business by over 50 to 75% in the next 3 months. In terms of a realistic sense, if we're going to talk about it in terms of a monetary number, I will make about $100,000 on my cattle business in the next 3 months. And my income is, I've taken a look at it. I understand what is happening, and I will continue to do better for myself. That's the big idea. And another way to take a look at this is if I started to act like a poor person, if I legitimately became a poor person, I have decided today, starting right now, I will go and be poor. What are some things that I can do? Go and live my dream. YOLO, right? I might as well just spend the money. Oh my God, you know, I've always wanted to whatever, buy this and that, and you know, time for me to go to the Lamborghini dealership. How long do you think it would take me from starting to act like a poor person to becoming a poor person? It wouldn't even take 48 hours, maybe 24 hours. I would legitimately be poor within 24 hours. And that is why it is so bad to think like a poor person. Legitimately, that is why it is so detrimental to be a poor person. Because even in my situation, if I decided to be a poor person, I would become poor within 24 hours. Instantaneously. That's why you don't want to think and act like a poor person. What is a reasonable thing to do with money? Make more money with it, right? You should not be spending more money than you make. If you're spending more money than you make, you need to get a hold of your situation and reduce your expenses. And, you know, in a realistic sense, you should also increase your income. Look for a better job. Find some opportunity. All right, because what's going to happen is in a very realistic possibility of being poor is that you legitimately end up at 75 years old with no retirement. That's what it could turn into, all right? And you don't want to end up in that situation, all right? You know, it's not good, you know, but, you know, don't choose to be poor, all right? Don't ever choose to be poor. Even if your two options are be poor or be broke, choose to be broke. All right, you're better off being broke. You don't want to be in a situation where you're choosing to be poor. You know, but also understand that there is a possibility, there is a third outcome, and that is that you do better for yourself, legitimately, to a degree that legitimately puts you in a situation where you do not have to worry about money anymore. And real quick, let's talk about the 10%, because I talk about getting to the 10% mark. And let's talk about this in terms of, let's pencil it out. So let's say that you have bought a 20-acre field, and for this 20-acre field, you are paying $1,000 a month for it, which is effectively about the going rate. So if you're paying $1,000 a month for a field, and you are, you know, growing grass on it 8 months out of the year, and let's say that when you average out the cost for the entire year for you to fertilize the grass, it is costing you $400 a month. Over, you know, effectively, let's just say $5,000 a year for you to fertilize that 20 acres of grass. And on that 20 acres of grass, so you're using $5,000 a month, and you're using $12,000 a year. So you're using $17,000 a year to pay for your land and to pay for the fertilizer, right? And let's say that you have other expenses of, let's just say $3,000, all right? You know, $3,000, antibiotics, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So your total expenses for the year are $20,000. If you have a total expense for $20,000, and let's say that you have taken a look at the business plan and you understand that if you take an animal from 350 pounds to 750 pounds, you can make $500 of net profit. So if you can make $500 of net profit on an animal, and you need $34,000, or you need $20,000 a year to run your business, to pay for your land and to pay for everything that you need $20,000 a year. And each animal makes you a net profit of $500 a year, or, you know, not a year. Each animal makes you a net profit of $500. How many animals a year would you have to run just to break even? You would have to run 40 animals a year. That's it. If you ran 2 lots of 20 animals a year, if you ran 20 animals 2 times a year on your 20-acre field, you could pay for the land and you could pay for everything that you need to farm. That's how it works out. All right, you could you know, pay for the land, and you could pay for the everything that you need to farm that 20 acres. The business will pay for itself. You don't have to worry about the money. And just to put things in perspective, when you look at my results, and I'm not saying that you should compare yourself to me, I'm telling you this just to tell you that it's possible. When you look at my results, how many cattle do I run a year on 10.5 acres? About 150. All right, you know, maybe even 170. All right, that's how many animals I run on a 10.5 acre field a year. I run more than 2 lots of cattle a year. I run about 3 or 4. All right, so when you take a, maybe I run about 120, 140, something like that, on a 10.5 acre field. And when I run these animals and I grow the grass, even when I graze the grass 24/7 with 3 or 4 animals per acre, the grass still outgrows the grazing. The grass is still up to my shins. The grass is still up to my waist. So that's just a realistic look at it. If you got to the 10% mark, you would not have to worry about the money anymore. If you had a 20-acre field and all you did on that 20-acre field was grow some grass and run 2 sets of animals a year, and you ran them from 350 pounds to, let's just say, 700 pounds. If that was all you did the entire year on that 20-acre field, you just ran 40 cattle a year, 20 at a time, 2 times a year. If that was all you did, you would still make all of your money back. And then, you can work on doing better. Work on doing better from that point. And in terms of a realistic sense, when you look at my numbers, I run about 100, maybe about 140 cattle a year on a 10.5 acre field. Maybe even a little bit more. I'm already at 90 animals for the year, and it's only been 6 months. Maybe I run about, 200 animals, 170 animals a year. All right, and that's what my numbers look like. And when I do this and I grow the grass, I graze the grass at 3 to 4 animals per acre, 500 pounders. And the grass still outgrows the grazing. By the end of the year, the grass had actually already gone up to like my waist, gone to seed and died. The cattle could not graze it. The grass grew too fast. But that's a very realistic way to look at it. That's what the 10% mark looks like. 20-acre field with 40 cattle on it a year. If you manage to just do that, you can at least pay for the land, and you can pay for it. Your business will pay for itself. You don't have to worry about the expenses anymore, because now you can practice for free. And just understand that my results are what they are, and I'm not lying about it. On a 10.5 acre field, I've already ran 90 cattle for the year, and it's been 6 months. If you ran 40 cattle a year on a 20-acre field and that was all you did, you would still not have to worry about the money anymore. The business would pay for itself. And I'm not lying about it. I'm being completely straightforward, honest about it. All right, and if you got to that point and then you continue to work on doing better, then maybe one day you can make it too, all right? I legitimately had to work my entire life to do this. I'm not making that up. I mean, you want to go and figure it out for yourself, go and do it. But don't choose to be poor, okay? Don't ever choose to be poor. It doesn't matter, it doesn't matter what your reasoning is to be poor. It's borderline insane. Oh my God, I might as well just go and live my dream. It's always been my dream. Nobody cares about your dream. Do are we talking about money, or are we talking about some delusional fantasy? Figure out the money, and then you can go and, and then you can, at a certain point when you make enough money, nothing really costs anything. All right, me, I can effectively buy anything on the entire planet already. But if I started to act like a poor person, I would legitimately become poor over 24 hours. All right, and that's it for me today, YouTube. Y'all have a good one.